Broadcasting live from the Newsmax studio in New York City, here is Steve Malzberg.
All right, folks, welcome back to the Steve Malzberg Show. Joining us now is David Swerdlick, columnist and contributing editor for TheRoot.com. And David, welcome back, sir.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for having me.
All right, you wrote a piece, and the headline was, No Rush Limbaugh, African-American voters aren't Uncle Toms, we're just smart. I did not hear the show in question. You pull out a quote. I'm sure you did it in good faith. But I would guess that he wasn't actually calling them Uncle Toms. He was referring to the fact that many in the black community, and it's accepted by the leftist media, refer to blacks who are Republican or vote Republican as Uncle Tom. I don't think he was literally calling them that, although, like I said, I didn't hear it. I would just, knowing Rush, would guess that's what he was talking about. And he was referring to the blacks who came out and voted for Thad Cochran. Oh, you're Uncle Toms in a way that would throw it back at those people, you know, who voted for him, because that's what the left would normally do, or some leftist blacks would do to conservative blacks who vote Republican. But that aside, you defend the fact, or support the fact, that so many blacks came out in that runoff election and voted for Thad Cochran. Why?
Well, first of all, Steve, let me just say this. What Limbaugh said was, what are they calling themselves? Uncle Toms for Cochran?
Well, that's because black liberal blacks often call blacks who vote for Republicans Uncle Toms.
Hear me out. What I said in my piece was that maybe Limbaugh thought he was joking. I'm sure, you know, he thinks he's a funny guy. Maybe he thought he was trying to be funny. But either way, it's an offensive use of the term. And I'll further clarify with you, Steve, that I personally don't condone the use of the term in any context. Not when Rush Limbaugh uses it.
Okay,
I don't condone it when people call black conservatives Uncle Toms either. You know, it's just an insult, and it doesn't get the discussion anywhere.
Fair enough.
To your question about the people who voted in that runoff election in Mississippi, my view is that people acted in a completely rational self-interest to vote for the Republican that they found least offensive in that particular election, in that particular context. If anybody voted that, you know, and broke the rules by voting, if they had voted in the Democratic primary first and then voted in the Republican runoff, then their votes should be stricken or discounted. I'm not for breaking the rules, but I have no problem with people, African-American voters who are primarily Democratic, participating in the Republican race if they think they're going to get a better deal from one candidate than from the other candidate. Cochran came across to people as a Republican that they could accept, and McDaniel, I think, came across as a Republican that was unacceptable, and that's why they voted that way.
Do you think the flyer that I'm holding in my hand, that John Fund posted on National Review the day after the election, which says that in bold letters, the Tea Party intends to prevent blacks from voting on Tuesday, and then they list Cochran as a civil rights supporter, and Chris McDaniel as quite the opposite. Do you think that let's turn out for all Mississippians and vote for Cochran? Thad Cochran works for all Mississippians. Mississippi cannot and will not return to the bygone era of intimidating black Mississippians from voting. We must rise up on Tuesday to have our voices heard. Blah, 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 blah. How do you feel about that flyer?
Steve, a lot of conservatives have portrayed that as race baiting, and here's my response to that. Again, let me be crystal clear. As far as I understand, the rules of the Mississippi runoff were that if people had voted in the Democratic primary, they couldn't then turn around and vote in the Republican runoff. And if anybody did that, their vote should be stricken.
Agreed.
That being said, any of these other tactics that people are coming after, or this general resentment that African Americans actually, you know, collectively made a smart move and backed Cochran, I think it's really a smokescreen on the part of Republicans. Look, African Americans do think that Republicans, particularly the far-right Tea Party version of Republicans, have made moves to try to limit the rights of African Americans to vote, not just in Mississippi, but elsewhere. It's these 25 or 30 states where Republicans and ALEC and other conservative networks have backed these restrictive voter ID laws, reduce early voting, et cetera. People do think that that is an effort to get black people out of the electorate. And until people think otherwise, that kind of campaigning is not only going to be persuasive, I think it rings true for a lot of people.
So the Tea Party intends to prevent blacks from voting on Tuesday as the headline on a flyer. You have no problem. How are they going to prevent black people from voting on Tuesday?
Look, campaigns make outlandish claims all the time, and this one is actually rooted in the ground already being set, Steve, as African Americans. But you know what? I'm not going to put it in the third person, Steve. I think it. Okay. I'm not putting it on the party or on the Tea Party. I'm saying in general, conservatives over the last several years have pushed initiatives in a variety of states designed to keep people of color, younger people, seniors out of the electorate, to shrink the electorate, because Republican candidates do better when the electorate is smaller. There's no reason to put in these restrictive voter ID laws in states where there's no measurable voter fraud. There's certainly no reason to put in to reduce early voting. Early voting just means more people will vote.
David, you yourself just talked about the accusation that there are people who voted illegally in this very election we're talking about. And if there were voter ID in place and a system to check further on these people who voted, black, white, green, yellow, I don't care what color they are, it has nothing to do with color, just if they were Democrats who had previously voted, we'd all be a lot better off. Now there's a chance that this whole election is going to be overturned. How could you say there's no problem with voter fraud?
Steve, if any of those allegations is proven in court, then I think that there will be a case for that. What I don't think there's a case for is any of the recent national elections that we've seen or statewide elections we've seen in recent years when these voter initiatives have been coming about. And I think that in this case, again, it doesn't excuse anybody if they knowingly broke the rules. But let's face it, this was a peculiar situation of a state that has an open primary system, but has a rule that people can't vote in a runoff if they voted in a previous primary 3 weeks earlier. And it's a situation where a lot of people don't know the rules, because this situation hardly ever comes up in Mississippi or anywhere else.
Ignorance of the law is not
no, it's not. But no, it's not. But why were Republicans or conservatives pushing these voter ID laws before this happened?
Because you know what? I hate to tell you, the overwhelming majority of this country is in favor of voter ID laws. You can't do anything. You can't open a bank account without a photo ID. How is it racist to expect people to have a photo ID in the year 2014? Would you explain that to me?
I didn't say it was racist. I said that conservatives, Republicans do better in elections when the electorate is smaller.
And how is that going to keep the electorate smaller? How is proving who you are going to keep the electorate smaller?
How is reducing early voting going to?
Now you're talking about something. Now you're going to a different topic. Talk about voter ID. How is voter ID, which you bring up as conservatives wanting to keep seniors and blacks and this one and that one out, how is it going to do it?
Steve, again, look.
How? Tell me how.
I've heard all the conservative arguments that say.
How? I'm asking you your argument. How?
People say you can't open a bank account, you can't get on a plane without ID. Yeah. That's all true. Those aren't rights under the Constitution.
No. How is it going to limit voting?
I'm sorry, say that again?
How is it going to cut down the number of people able to vote? You're telling me people don't have IDs?
These laws, in my view, are designed to discourage people from going to polls.
How
they don't have the proper
to do it.
forms of ID. There are people who are citizens who have every right to vote, who may not have the proper form of ID, who may not have obtained the proper form of ID by the time of an election. And if the law is that they have to have an ID, then they have to have an ID. But putting these laws in place, A, is designed to shrink the electorate.
How? But you won't tell me how. David, I'm begging you. How? David, I'm trying to give you a chance to explain your claim. How? What's to prevent someone from getting an ID? How is this going to how is this an attempt to try to lower the electorate, the participatory electorate? How?
Steve, study after study has found that there is no measurable voter fraud in these states.
Now you're changing your story. Now you're going to something else again.
No, I'm telling you the facts. I'm saying to you that study after study in these states where voter fraud has less than 1%, less than 2% in a lot of these cases, voter fraud in statewide elections.
You're talking about 100
statewide elections.
You're talking about 100,000 votes or more, or tens of thousands of votes. 1 or 2% is pretty significant to me. But again, that's not the issue. I'll ask one more time: how does having to have a photograph, an ID, limit the voting pool, the voting population?
Because there are people who are citizens, who are eligible to vote, who have every right to vote, some of whom don't have ID.
You don't get it.
Well, Steve, that is an issue that those people will have to face if the law is changed. But I'm suggesting to you that the motivation behind these laws is not to combat voter fraud, but to keep these people away from the polls.
And all these people have to do is have a picture taken, and then they're back at the polls. So I don't really. Hey, David, we'll have to agree to disagree because I'm up against the clock. Great piece. Also, check out David's great piece at theroot.com on liberals and progress they've made. We'll talk again, David. Thank you. Up next, Gimme 5.